Imagine waking up one morning thousands of years ago to find blood on your clothes with no wound, no explanation, and no medical knowledge to tell you what was happening. For countless girls throughout history, that moment marked the beginning of one of life's biggest transitions, and every culture had its own way of explaining it. The first period wasn't just a biological event, it often changed an entire life overnight. The biggest misconception about ancient women is that they had no idea what menstruation was until it happened. In many societies, that simply wasn't true. Long before written textbooks or modern biology, knowledge was passed from one generation to the next. Mothers, grandmothers, older sisters, aunts, and experienced women often prepared girls for puberty through conversation, observation, and shared experience. Exactly how much was explained varied enormously between cultures, but anthropologists have found that female knowledge networks were central to teaching young girls about reproduction. That mattered because a first period could arrive unexpectedly. In ancient populations, the average age of menarche was often later than it is today, likely influenced by nutrition, disease, and overall health. While many modern girls begin menstruating between ages 11 and 13, archaeological and historical evidence suggests that girls in many ancient societies frequently experienced their first period somewhat later. When it happened, however, childhood was increasingly seen as ending. In many communities, menstruation signaled that a girl had entered a new stage of life, even though she was still physically and emotionally developing. That transition often brought new responsibilities, different clothing, different expectations, sometimes entirely different social rules. A biological change lasting only a few days each month could permanently reshape a girl's place within her community. One question historians are asked constantly is surprisingly simple. What did ancient women actually use? The answer depended entirely on where they lived and what materials surrounded them. There was never one universal solution. Ancient Egyptians are believed to have used softened papyrus fibers as absorbent material. In parts of the Greek and Roman worlds, women likely relied on folded linen cloths, wool, or other available textiles, although surviving evidence is limited because such materials rarely preserve well over thousands of years. Elsewhere, women adapted to local environments. Historical and ethnographic evidence records the use of moss, soft plant fibers, bark cloth, cotton, animal skins, woven grass, or other absorbent natural materials in different parts of the world. Many of these items could be washed, dried, and reused repeatedly. Nothing was mass-produced. Everything required effort. Imagine preparing every menstrual product entirely by hand, using only materials gathered from nature or produced within the household. For most women throughout history, that wasn't unusual. It was simply another practical skill learned alongside cooking, weaving, or gathering food. Modern disposable products are a remarkably recent invention. For thousands of years before that, survival depended not on convenience but on resourcefulness, and that resourcefulness shaped nearly every aspect of daily life during menstruation. How a girl's first period was treated depended less on biology than on culture. Some societies welcomed it with celebration, others surrounded it with strict rules. Anthropologists have documented coming-of-age ceremonies across many indigenous cultures, where a girl's first menstruation marked her transition toward adulthood. These ceremonies varied enormously. Some involved instruction from older women, special clothing, songs, fasting, or periods of reflection. Their purpose was often educational as much as symbolic, preparing young women for the responsibilities expected within their communities. In other civilizations, menstruation became associated with ideas of ritual purity. Ancient Jewish law, preserved in the Hebrew Bible, included detailed regulations concerning menstruation. Similar concepts appeared in parts of ancient India and other regions, although the beliefs and practices differed significantly from one culture to another. These rules reflected religious and cultural traditions rather than medical understanding. There was no universal ancient experience. A girl born in Egypt might encounter very different customs than one growing up in Greece, China, Mesopotamia, or the Andes. The same biological event, completely different meanings. That's one reason historians avoid broad statements about ancient women. Ancient history covered thousands of years and countless civilizations. Every society interpreted menstruation through its own beliefs about health, religion, family, and womanhood. The greatest challenge wasn't always the bleeding itself, it was hygiene. Today, clean running water, soap, washing machines, and private bathrooms are easy to take for granted. Ancient women often had none of those conveniences. Reusable cloths had to be washed by hand whenever clean water was available. In dry regions, water was precious and often prioritized for drinking or cooking. In colder climates, washing and drying absorbent materials during winter could be difficult. Even storing clean cloth safely required care to protect it from insects, dirt, and moisture. Despite these obstacles, women developed practical routines. Many communities understood through experience that regularly cleaning reusable materials made them more comfortable and longer lasting, even if they didn't understand bacteria or infection in the modern scientific sense. Knowledge accumulated through generations, not laboratories. Daily life itself became the teacher. Privacy also mattered. In crowded homes where several generations lived together, finding a quiet place to change or wash menstrual materials wasn't always easy. Women adapted by working within the routines of their households and communities. What appears inconvenient today was simply normal life then. Ancient women didn't compare their situation with modern products. They solved problems using the resources available to them. That ability to adapt quietly and repeatedly was one of the least recorded but most remarkable survival skills in human history. And as you'll see next, some of the beliefs surrounding menstruation became even more powerful than the physical experience itself. Now here's where history becomes surprisingly complicated. Many ancient people believed menstruation possessed unusual power. Not because they understood hormones or reproductive biology, but because anything mysterious often attracted supernatural explanations. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded extraordinary claims about menstruating women. He wrote that menstrual blood could sour wine, dull metal, damage crops, and even affect storms. Modern science has found no evidence to support these beliefs, but they reveal how ancient societies sometimes tried to explain natural events through superstition rather than observation. Similar beliefs appeared elsewhere. Some communities viewed menstruation as spiritually powerful. Others considered it ritually impure. A few traditions treated it with both respect and caution at the same time. The important point is this: these ideas reflected cultural beliefs, not biological reality. That distinction matters because ancient people interpreted the world through religion, tradition, and inherited knowledge long before modern medicine existed. For a young girl experiencing her first period, those beliefs shaped how she understood her own body. If her community celebrated menstruation, she might view it as an honorable step into adulthood. If her culture surrounded it with restrictions, the experience could feel confusing or intimidating. The biology remained the same. The meaning changed completely. Another popular myth is that girls in ancient times immediately became mothers after their first period. The truth is more nuanced. Menstruation signals that reproduction has become biologically possible. It does not mean the body has reached full physical maturity. Modern medicine shows that the pelvis, bones, and many other systems continue developing for years after menarche. The same was true in ancient populations. Historical records do show that some societies arranged marriages during adolescence, but actual practices varied enormously across time and place. Economic conditions, social class, local customs, and regional laws all influenced when marriage and childbirth occurred. There was no single ancient timeline. An aristocratic girl in Rome lived under different expectations than a farmer's daughter in China. A nomadic pastoral community followed different traditions than a settled farming village. Even neighboring cultures often disagreed about the proper age for marriage. History refuses to fit into simple stereotypes. What remained constant was that a first period often changed how society viewed a girl, regardless of whether she was emotionally or physically ready for adult responsibilities. That shift carried enormous weight. Overnight, expectations could change, responsibilities could increase, childhood could seem much farther away, not because her body had finished growing, but because her community believed she had entered a completely new chapter of life. And that difference between biology and social expectation shaped the lives of millions of women throughout history. One of the greatest misconceptions about ancient menstruation is that women simply endured it alone. In reality, women often relied on one another. Across cultures, the most reliable source of information was usually another experienced woman. Anthropologists studying traditional societies have repeatedly found that practical knowledge about menstruation, pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care was commonly shared through female relatives and trusted members of the community rather than formal education. This was knowledge built over generations. Which plants were soft enough to use, how to wash reusable cloth, how to reduce discomfort with warmth or rest when possible, how to recognize when bleeding seemed unusually heavy or prolonged. None of this required modern science. It required observation. Every generation added another layer of experience. By the time a young girl experienced her first period, countless women before her had already solved many of the same practical problems. Their advice wasn't written inside medical textbooks. It lived in memory, and memory was one of humanity's oldest survival tools. Without those informal networks, everyday life would have been far more difficult for young women entering puberty. Knowledge passed quietly from one woman to another may have saved more suffering than history will ever record. That doesn't mean every first period was understood correctly. Ancient medicine often misunderstood the female body. Greek physician Hippocrates and later Roman physician Galen made enormous contributions to early medicine, yet many of their explanations of menstruation reflected the scientific limitations of their time. Various ancient medical traditions believed menstrual blood helped remove excess fluids or restore balance within the body according to theories that are no longer accepted today. Those ideas influenced treatment for centuries. Physicians sometimes recommended changes in diet, exercise, bathing, or herbal remedies based on medical theories rather than biological evidence. Some approaches may have provided comfort. Others almost certainly had little effect. Even so, these doctors were attempting something important. They were searching for natural explanations instead of attributing every bodily process solely to supernatural forces. That marked an important step in the history of medicine. Not because they had all the answers, but because they were asking questions. Modern science has shown that menstruation is the shedding of the uterine lining when pregnancy does not occur, regulated by complex hormonal changes. Ancient physicians didn't know that. They had no microscopes, no hormone testing, no understanding of ovaries releasing eggs. Yet, they observed patterns carefully enough to recognize that menstruation was a normal part of many women's lives rather than a random illness. Sometimes they reached the wrong conclusions. But observation itself laid the foundation for discoveries that would come many centuries later. And those discoveries would completely transform how humanity understood one of its oldest biological experiences. What archaeology tells us about menstruation is just as revealing as what it cannot tell us. Unlike stone tools or pottery, menstrual materials were usually made from cloth, plant fibers, leather, or other organic materials that decay over time. After thousands of years, very little survives. That means historians rarely discover ancient menstrual products directly. Instead, they piece together evidence from many different sources: ancient medical writings, religious texts, household artifacts, artistic depictions, ethnographic studies of traditional societies. Together, these fragments create a surprisingly detailed picture of how women adapted to one of life's most universal experiences. But they also remind us to be cautious. When someone confidently claims that all ancient women used the same method, the evidence simply doesn't support it. History is rarely that simple. The farther you travel across continents and centuries, the more diverse human solutions become. One civilization relied on linen, another used locally available plant fibers. A third developed completely different customs based on its climate and resources. There was never one ancient world. There were hundreds of them, each solving the same biological challenge in its own way. Perhaps the most remarkable truth is how ordinary menstruation eventually became. A girl's first period might have been unforgettable. The ones that followed became part of everyday life. Women still gathered food, prepared meals, raised children, made clothing, worked in fields, managed households, traveled with families. In many societies, menstruation did not stop daily responsibilities. Although certain religious or cultural practices sometimes placed temporary restrictions on specific activities, the ordinary work of survival continued. Life in the ancient world was demanding, and few people could simply pause their responsibilities every month. That reality required resilience, not because women ignored discomfort, because daily life left little choice. For thousands of years, generations of women quietly adapted to recurring challenges without modern sanitation products, pain medication, or detailed scientific knowledge of reproductive health. Their stories were rarely written down. Kings filled history books, generals received monuments, inventors earned recognition. The practical knowledge that helped millions of women navigate puberty and menstruation was usually passed on in conversations that left almost no archaeological trace. Yet, those quiet lessons shaped human history just as surely as battles or empires. Sometimes the most important knowledge isn't carved into stone. It's carried from one generation to the next. And because of that, countless girls faced one of life's biggest changes with guidance, instead of complete uncertainty. The final lesson may be the most important one of all. So how did ancient women handle their first periods? Not with modern medicine, not with disposable products, and certainly not with one universal method. They handled them the same way humans have overcome countless other challenges throughout history, by adapting. Every civilization developed solutions shaped by its own environment, beliefs, and available resources. Some girls received careful guidance from mothers and grandmothers before menstruation began. Others learned only after experiencing it for the first time. Some communities marked the occasion with ceremonies that celebrated adulthood. Others surrounded it with religious rules or social restrictions. The biology remained remarkably consistent. The experience did not. What united these women wasn't a shared culture. It was shared resilience. Generation after generation, they found ways to stay clean, continue working, care for their families, and pass practical knowledge to the girls who followed them. Very little of that wisdom appeared in official history. Yet without it, every society would have struggled to survive. After all, every civilization depended on women successfully navigating puberty, fertility, pregnancy, and motherhood. These weren't private experiences separated from history. They were history. When people imagine the ancient world, they usually picture pyramids, temples, armies, and famous rulers. But history wasn't built only by kings. It was built inside ordinary homes by ordinary people solving ordinary problems every single day. A young girl experiencing her first period thousands of years ago probably felt many of the same emotions someone might feel today. Confusion, curiosity, embarrassment, perhaps even fear. The world around her looked different. The explanation she received was different. The materials she used were different. But the biological moment itself connected her to billions of women across human history. That connection stretches from prehistoric campsites to Egyptian villages, Roman towns, Chinese farming communities, indigenous settlements, and eventually to the modern world. Technology changed. Medicine advanced. Scientific understanding transformed completely. Yet the first period remained one of humanity's most universal experiences. Perhaps that's the most remarkable lesson. Ancient women weren't mysterious figures living lives beyond our understanding. They were people adapting to their circumstances with intelligence, creativity, and resilience, just as humans have always done. Their solutions may seem unfamiliar today. Their emotions probably wouldn't. And that quiet continuity across thousands of years reminds us that some of the most important stories in history were never written in royal records or carved into monuments. They were lived, shared, and remembered, one generation of women at a time.